on this computer. There we go.
All right. Okay, so welcome to all of our guests for tuning in all over the world, and welcome to the Idealist Society of North America's third event in our summer series. We're very excited about our presenter today. We're also celebrating the paperback release of our presenters for Benjamin Norris's text, Schelling and Spinoza, Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute. So just before I introduce Ben and what the event will be about today, I'd just like to tell you about who we are and what we are. So the Idealist Society of North America is an international group of academics and scholars and researchers dedicated to cultivating a space for the study of idealist philosophy. Broadly construed, our mission is to intertwine the wider tradition of idealism from Plato to the present with this tradition's instantiation in the fields of 18th and 19th century German idealism and the 19th and 20th century British and American idealism. We view these movements as particularly important moments in the idealist tradition, and seek to establish a broader continuity of these movements with the idealist tradition as a whole. So we're committed to no single definition of idealism and instead embrace the vicissitudes of the idealist tradition in full. And so to advance research in the idealist tradition and its prominent proponents and critics, ISNA seeks to bring together scholars across the world through workshops and conferences. So ISNA is particularly interested in acting as a workshop space for developing lines of idealist research in order to advocate for the contemporary relevance of all forms of idealism. And today, Benjamin Norris is going to navigate us through an informal discussion on the legacy of F.H. Jacobi and the debate between realism and idealism in contemporary philosophy. So though Jacobi remains a somewhat obscure figure, Jacobi was well known to the post-Kantian idealists. In fact, the controversies inspired by his works were the forge in which the young Hegel and Schelling began to shape their unique contributions to the history of idealist philosophy. So drawing from his book, Dr. Norris's text, Schelling and Spinoza, Realism and Idealism and the Absolute, Ben will outline Jacobi's framing of the impasse between realism and idealism and its relevance for understanding both the historical and contemporary idealism. So Dr. Benjamin Norris has a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research. He is the author of Schelling and Spinoza, Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute from State University, New York Press, 2022, as well as articles on the relationship between German idealism and contemporary continental philosophy. And he currently teaches at Rowan University. So Ben is also the secretary of the Idealist Society of North America. And I just wanted to, before I hand it over to Ben, our event today will be divided into two parts. So the first part will be Ben's discussion, his paper that he'll be presenting, which will be about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a question and answers period chaired by our vice president, Paolo Camparisi. And we do hope you do enjoy the event. And if you have any questions, please keep them for the question and answer period. And we're excited to have you here today. So I'm going to pass it over now to Ben. And thank you. Give it away, Ben.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, everybody, for being here on a Saturday afternoon. I really appreciate it. So I was thinking about it, and in a certain sense, this is a kind of one-year anniversary event. I believe the hardcover of the book came out in August of 2022, but honestly, I have a hard time remembering that kind of stuff. So like Chris said, what I want to do is present a couple sections of the book. I'm hoping to speak for about 30 minutes. And the overall goal is to look at how Jacobi's critique of idealism is set up and really the resemblance that it has to a lot of kind of modern forms of realism and realist philosophy. And then what I'm interested in exploring in the discussion is, the various ways that idealism sort of after Kant, Schelling, Hegel is able to respond, if at all, to some of these criticisms. Because I think there's an interesting force behind them, despite the fact that Jacobi might not always be the most, let's say, sensitive reader of certain philosophical traditions. So, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and read probably for about 30 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it to that. So in general, when idealism is taken to be anti-realist in its nature, then realism is viewed as an antidote to the errors of idealism. For the post-Kantian German idealists, it is Jacobi who frames this dilemma most succinctly. Jacobi takes transcendental idealism to be nothing short of madness. Jacobi's challenge has by no means been overcome by the history of philosophy separating Jacobi and us. In fact, the fear of idealism's madness provides a punctual framing of a narrative that brings together the debate between realism and anti-realism in analytic and continental philosophical circles. Further, these contemporary debates regarding realism and idealism demonstrate that Jacobi's dramatic diagnosis of idealism is more timeless than his contemporaries might have hoped. So Jacobi delivers his diagnosis of idealism as madness succinctly in his dialogue David Hume on Faith, or Realism and Idealism. The dialogue takes place between the characters he and I. He makes the following claim, with which I subsequently agrees. Quote, "You forget Wahnsinn, madness, or being out of one's senses, a word whose meaning strikes upon me quite forcefully at the moment. We say that a man is out of his senses when he takes images to be sensations or actual things, and thus we deny that he is rational, because his representations, which he takes to be things, lack the thing or the sensible truth, because he regards something as actual which is not." So the two interlocutors find common ground in the idea that the idealist flirts with madness when individual representations are granted sufficient reality onto themselves. Thinking of this kind risks the loss of the thing. Without the thing, without the sensible truth, without actual content, philosophy is indistinguishable from hallucination. In order to combat this madness generated by the fervor of philosophy's unbounded rational pursuit, Jacobi turns not to irrationalism, as is often assumed, and I'm going to discuss that just a little bit more shortly, but instead he turns to realism. So against those who would dismiss Jacobi as an unsophisticated reactionary, we can see that he in fact offers a deep insight into the persistent problem of idealism. Recent continental philosophy is largely motivated by a rejection of the allegedly anti-realist epistemological commitments of a wide range of views that rely on contextualism or coherentism. The post-continental philosophers represent a renewed interest in metaphysical and ontological realism. Another more contemporary way of framing Jacobi's fear has to do with the role of mind dependence in the construction of reality. So Brock and Mayers broadly define realism through the following two theses. Quote, "Realism about a particular domain is the conjunction of the following two theses. One, there are facts or entities distinctive of that domain. And two, their existence and nature is in some important sense objective and mind independent. Let us call the first thesis the existence thesis and the second thesis the independence thesis," end quote. So the existence thesis plays an important role in recent forms of new realism, but of primary importance for Jacobi is the second of these two theses. Idealism, Jacobi claims, takes images and sensations not to be of things that are ultimately mind independent. Instead, the idealist attributes reality to these sensations and images themselves, thereby erasing the need for any mind-independent foundation for their actuality. So without the independence thesis, representations can have no traction on the world as it actually is. To embrace the existence thesis while rejecting the independence thesis strongly implies a two-world metaphysical picture in which there are existing but inaccessible things on the one side and our subjective representations of these things on the other. The challenge the independence thesis brings with it, then, is the problem of access. So if it is wrong to take one's sensations and representations as objectively real on their own, how are we to bridge the gap between the subjective and the objective? So Christopher Norris argues that anti-realism has become the norm in both analytic and continental philosophy. The general claim is that any philosophy that relies upon holist or coherentist theories of truth is susceptible to the charge of anti-realism. Following the insights of thinkers like Quine, Wittgenstein, Davidson, and Rorty, the doctrine of immediate correspondence between the conceptual and non-conceptual, constitutive of previous empiricisms, was no longer a viable epistemic option. As these 20th century criticisms of empiricism demonstrate, truth can no longer be grounded in an immediate correspondence between thought and world. Instead, the truth value of any claim must primarily be assessed in relation to the coherence of a conceptual scheme and not in relation to some extra-conceptual scheme-independent content. So Norris frames the central shared claim of the anti-realists as, quote, the idea of scientific truth or reality that is relative to or constructed within some culture-specific discourse framework of inquiry, historical paradigm, conceptual scheme, or whatever, end quote. Or, as Bhaskar frames the same point, quote, the postmodernist says basically that reality is a social construct. Reality is a construct of discourse, the text, the conversation, or if you like, people or even power relations. End quote. So the inheritance of this general contextualist and allegedly postmodernist framework led to the dogma that truth can only be articulated within the self-referential network of discursive claims and commitments. Again, this anti-realism is of a specific sort. It does not directly deny the existence of reality internal to discourses, texts, language games, conceptual schemes, or whatever else. Instead, it pushes aside the independence thesis. Consequently, if there's nothing material about the material inference, then this kind of constructivism is nothing but a new form of fatally bloated idealism. So this transitions us to the resurgence of realism in recent continental philosophy. In an attempt to resist the anti-realist trend he saw in the doctrine, he saw during the close of the 20th century, by putting forth a reading of scientific realism in the critical realist tradition, Norris offers readings of Derrida's work and the essay White Mythology in particular. So the strategy is particularly intriguing in large part because of the role Derrida plays in the common narrative of the development of post-continental theory. I'm drawing the term post-continental from John Malarkey's 2007 book, Post-Continental Philosophy and Outline. Therein, he differentiates post-continental philosophy from previous continental philosophy on the one hand through a shared rejection of transcendence, and on the other hand, through the rejection of what Norris characterized as the restriction of philosophical attention to the analysis of closed self-referential discursive systems. As previously noted, this restriction brought with it the rejection of the correspondence between the conceptual and the extra-conceptual in favor of a self-referential conceptual linguistic nexus of meaning. The post-continental philosophers seek to move beyond both the correspondence relation between conceptual and extra-conceptual, as well as to combat the perceived unreality of coherentist philosophies of discourse. To do this, Malarkey argues, they turn to the notion of immanence in order to re-embed conceptual schemes within the real, in turn, giving privilege to the immanence of the real over the transcendence of the ideal. So Malarkey's analysis focuses on philosophical developments that appeared in a series of works and conversations from 1988 by Deleuze, Badiou, Michel Henry, and François Laurel. So the realist identified, as he says, too early, perhaps, by Malarkey, surged forward even more acutely in what came to be grouped under the heading of speculative realism. This general philosophical approach was articulated by Graham Harman, Ian Hamilton Grant, Ray Brassier, and Quentin Meillassoux during a 2007 workshop of the same name. Now, and here we return to Derrida, the broad strokes narrative of this renewed interest in realism among those working in the continental tradition of the early 21st century is that the generation of students following the work of Derrida and his contemporaries tired of the deconstruction of texts, of grammatology's famous proclamation that there is nothing outside of the text, was taken to read quite literally. In post-structuralism, so the story goes, there is only the text, there is only the language game, there is only the conceptual scheme, and this self-enclosed discursive construction is completely without relation to an independent and external reality. In his 1985 Carus lectures, Hilary Putnam refers to this as what he calls the extreme relativism of French philosophy. So, I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that this is not really a great reading of Derrida, but that's not necessarily the point here. But whatever the actual attitude was, following the structuralism and post-structuralism of the 20th century, continental philosophy once again became interested in the speculative enterprises conditioned by and responsive to real non-linguistic constraints. Though the initial four speculative realists have further parted ways theoretically, initially the project of speculative realism was to offer ontological solutions that can circumvent this issue of the unquestioned primacy of thinking over being. Each speculative realist takes up Meillassoux' challenge to the epistemological problem he terms correlationism. Meillassoux sees idealism in both Berkeley and Kant as artificially limiting the capacities of thought insofar as these kind of subject-centered idealisms disqualify any rational consideration of objectivity apart from its relation to subjectivity. So, much like in Norris's telling, this return to realism was a pushback against socially determined conceptual structures of intelligibility. The moral of the story is that in attempting to understand how we subjectively come to know the world, we have erased the very objective world we wish to know. So the debate between realism and anti-realism, and idealism by extension, is scaffolded by the largely uncontested philosophical dualism of immanence and transcendence. So I already noted Malarkey's isolation of immanence as a key shared commitment of post-continental philosophy. Robinson also turns to immanence in order to draw a strict division between two traditions or trajectories within continental philosophy. He classifies this demarcation in terms of a transcendent trajectory and an immanent trajectory. He claims that, quote, the transcendent Heideggerian, Derridian, Levinasian trajectory corresponds with a range of anti- or non-realist positions, while the immanent Nietzschean and Deleuzian trajectory corresponds more with various forms of non-essentialist realism. So according to Robinson, the trajectory of transcendence leads to anti-realism, while the trajectory of immanence leads to realism. This seems to imply that the problems generated by anti-realism can be solved through a more rigorous articulation of philosophical immanence. Trinton goes so far as to suggest that post-Kantian realisms must take the form of monism, and I'm quoting here, post-Kantian realisms can only exist as philosophies of immanence, end quote. However, if we take Jacobi seriously, we can see that the division Robinson draws here is not so easily maintained. For Jacobi, it is transcendence that renders realism possible. And as we will see, this is because Jacobi argues that any philosophy of immanence generates only internal self-referential structures that relate to nothing outside of these closed systems. So overall, these diagnoses from Jacobi, Malarkey, Norris, Robinson, and others bind tightly together the debates over realism and anti-realism to the philosophical categories of immanence and transcendence. Moreover, the various positions articulated in both continental and analytic philosophy display the lack of any simple articulation of the battle between philosophies of immanence and philosophies of transcendence. The independence thesis introduces a gap between thought and being. This gap must in turn be bridged somehow, yet the options for doing so, such as intuitive knowledge, knowing, experiential extrapolation, scientific investigation, a priori formalization, and so on, carry with them their own internal inconsistencies. So the transcendence implied by the independence theses generates just as many, if not more, problems than it sought to solve. In light of this, one returns to immanence, and we're back at where we started. Right. So in short, despite the 2 centuries separating contemporary philosophy from the inception of German idealism and the subsequent backlash articulated by Jacobi, the fear of a lost world persists. The madness of idealism and the hope that realism might act as an antidote to this madness remains. Okay, so now I'm going to hop to the second part of chapter 1 and really dig into some of Jacobi's concepts here. All right, so let's see how much I can get to. Okay, to understand fully the positive intent behind Jacobi's criticism of philosophy, we must turn to his ontological realism. Before delving deeper into Jacobi's realism, let's first briefly look at the errors generated by reading Jacobi as committed most centrally to irrationalism, what Schelling referred to in a letter as his reprobate doctrine of know-nothing. The relation between Schelling and Jacobi is quite entertaining. Schelling earlier sort of positively cites his work, then Jacobi wrote a pretty mean book about Schelling, so Schelling said some pretty mean letters about Jacobi, but then when he started giving his lectures on the history of philosophy and he gets into the positive philosophy, he seems to warm up to Jacobi a little bit more again. So I always find that to be a little bit entertaining. Okay, so because Jacobi targeted the reach of reason while praising his own non-knowledge, it seems plausible to assume that curtailing reason as such would satisfy Jacobi's concerns. Yet, although Jacobi continuously appeals to the necessary existence of something extra-rational that cannot be known in any properly philosophical sense, he was not committed to the outright dismissal of reason. So to quote from an article by Benjamin Crow, irrationalism often connotes a tendency towards or advocacy of arbitrariness in one's belief or decisions. The thought is that an irrationalist is someone who simply plumps for a particular belief or course of action without considering reasons for or against it, end quote. But if we dismiss Jacobi as an irrationalist, we miss the deeper insight of his work. For Jacobi, one ought not reject rational consideration outright as implicitly nihilistic. Instead, as Crow suggests, quote, rationality must be animated, as it were, by a variety of extra-rational considerations. These extra-rational considerations are in large part what grounds us as living beings within the world. So here's another quote. Reason is merely a refinement of our organic powers or of sensation and perception. That's from Crow. So more specifically, it is the immediate and non-inferential experience of ourselves as living beings in the world that acts as the ground for our reason. In other words, reason is not itself a transcendent faculty. Instead, right, our sapient capacities are sort of modifications of our worldly sentience. So consequently, Crow suggests that Jacobi is critical of, quote, a paradigm of rationality on which reason just means deductive or analytic patterns of inference. Which reason, oh yeah, sorry. Oh, right, and at the same time, Crow reads Jacobi as proposing a more naturalistic theory of rationality that situates it more firmly within human psychology, end quote. So if this is the case, it makes more sense why Jacobi would find a seemingly strange companion in Hume, despite the latter's explicit atheism, right? One of the things that we know Jacobi for is he liked to run around accusing people of being atheists. So why is it that he writes this dialogue where he really takes David Hume up as his guide, right? You know, Fichte, Schelling, none of these dudes claim to be atheists. Hume was very open about this in his writing. So why does Jacobi look to Hume? Good. So Hume too was not content with the rationalist doctrine of necessary connection, insofar as any evidence of necessary connection is always absent from experience. More broadly, Hume and Jacobi agree that philosophy becomes unhinged speculation when it loses its grounding in experience. So for Jacobi, and this is a quote from Jacobi, our natural cognition can never rise above the result of the relations of finite to finite, relations that flow back into one another, back and forth without end quote. Insofar as our reason is natural, it is by nature limited to know only the relations between finite things. Therefore, reason alone cannot bridge the infinite distance between the finite and the infinite that grounds the possibility of being, meaning, and truth without subsequently collapsing this distance and erasing the being it seeks to know. And that formulation is kind of drawn from Jacobi's criticism of Fichte in his famous open letter from, I believe, 1799. So to further understand why Jacobi would appeal to realism in order to combat nihilism, I want to go back a little bit more into this David Hume on faith, or idealism and realism. So though the letter to Fichte, in which Jacobi deploys the full accusation of nihilism, was not written until more than a decade later, this earlier work on Hume lays the ground for Jacobi's vision of the relationship between faith and knowledge that he believes is necessary to combat the madness of idealism. Jacobi's work on Hume attempts to clarify his appeal to the idea of faith earlier in his famous works on Spinoza. So contrary to Kant, who claimed to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith, Jacobi will attempt to ground all knowledge through the self-noted, idiosyncratic notion of faith. So, and this is a quote, the unusual sense that I made of the word faith in the letters concerning Spinoza refers to a need that is not mine, but a philosophy that claims that rational knowledge does not just deal in relations, but extends to the very existence of things and their properties, Jacobi writes in the work's prefatory note. He continues, according to this philosophy, there is a twofold knowledge of existence, one certain, the other uncertain. This latter, as I said in the Spinoza letters, should be called faith. end quote. So philosophy knows existence in two ways, one of which it is certain, and one through which it ought to acknowledge its own constitutive uncertainty. By calling attention to this distinction, Jacobi is not claiming that philosophy has excluded faith, but that philosophy needs to incorporate some operation of faith if it is to make claims about anything other than the relational appearance of things. Put anachronistically, and in the sort of language I was using in discussing the previous section, without a ground provided through faith, philosophy is an empty coherentism, a web of coherent inferences that nevertheless has no real material basis. Thus, if rationalist philosophy is to understand not just how things exist in relation to other things, but what those things actually are, rational knowing alone cannot disclose this ontological truth. So we can quote John Milbank. John Milbank is actually one of the few people I found who is kind of a contemporary champion of Jacobi in this weird way. So what he writes in relation to this, right, from the perspective of philosophy without faith, quote, what we truly know are only appearances. So in effect, once more, nothing, end quote. So the obvious question that remains is how faith can serve as a vehicle to ground certainty in existence. So in contrast to faithless philosophy susceptible to madness, Jacobi explains, quote, as a realist, I am forced to say that all knowledge derives exclusively from faith, for things must be given before I am in a position to inquire about relations, end quote. So as a realist, Jacobi claims of himself. The bulk of Jacobi's criticism can be said to be realist insofar as it extensively concerns the problem of experiential given as independent of rational thought. Inferential knowledge of the relations between things can never by itself produce certainty in the givenness of those things. And in part, a thing is distinct, and in part because a thing is distinct from the thought of that thing. As noted above, there must be an infinite distance between a thing and the thought of it. On the other hand, we have the problem of philosophy's ontological legitimacy. Oh, I'm sorry. On the one hand, we have the problem of philosophy's ontological legitimacy, that is, its ability to say something about something. And then on the other hand, we have the problem of philosophy's systematic aspirations, its ability to say something about everything. So once again, we see that philosophy leaves itself without the resources needed to atone for its original sin. Pure reason renders the notion of the thing in itself necessary while being incapable of replacing veritable givenness and certainty. The finite intellect is unable to bridge the gap between thought and thing. Alternatively, right, according to Jacobi, faith is supposed to be non-inferential and immediate. Consequently, faith must provide undistorted access to the givenness of things that ground thoughts. In an essay by G. Anthony Bruno, he puts it this way: Jacobi's conception of faith thus supports a realism for which object signifies transcendental reality. Furthermore, faith as non-predicative certainty does not collapse the infinite chasm between the thought and the thing. It allows this chasm to remain infinite while simultaneously acknowledging the necessity of an unknowable core that necessarily grounds all knowledge. Okay, so I was going to do, okay, so basically one of the things that Jacobi does in order to explain his realism is he appeals to this notion of life, right? He says that concepts such as multiplicity, causality, these kind of things, these are living notions that we only have because we are living beings. So I have a section where I kind of go through this. You might remember the quote from Crow earlier about how, you know, what Jacobi is really trying to do is not reject reason, but to sort of renaturalize reason within the sort of almost like naive realist picture, right? So but I think I'm going to skip over that and get to a section on Jacobi's Salta Mortale and how that relates to realism, this kind of common sense realism, maybe even like an ordinary language kind of approach to philosophy. And then I will wrap up. So probably just about 10 more minutes. So life begins to bridge from the infinite to the finite, but it is not itself sufficient for avoiding the collapse of the infinite division between the finite and the infinite. We must turn to the salto mortale that Jacobi argues is necessary in order to return the finite intellect to the light of the creator and deliver it from the shadowy nightmare of philosophy. So the salto mortale is characterized as a kind of death-defying leap. In the salto, a circus performer would leap from a considerable height and turn their feet over their head, risking great injury and possibly death. In the air with their eyes turned towards the sky, the performer has no knowledge of where they will land, but must nonetheless believe that the world has not vanished at the moment of their leap. The performer must have faith that the world is still there waiting to catch them as they come back down. They must have faith in what they cannot know in order to be returned to an upright and no longer tumbling state. In his conversation with Lessing, detailed in the Spinoza letters, Jacobi appeals to the salto in the context of the infinite relation, in the context of the relation between the possibility of, quote, intuiting the manifold and the infinite, and Jacobi's belief in, quote, an intelligent personal cause of the world. So Jacobi explains to his interlocutor, quote, I extricate myself from the problem through a salto mortale, and I take it that you are not given to any pleasure in leaping with your head down, end quote. So the leap described here can be associated with what was taken as Jacobi's irrationalism. What cannot be proven demands faith, and at the limit of reason, one must leap without regard to their own safety. However, as the recent scholarship discussed previously shows, to pigeonhole Jacobi as an irrationalist obfuscates some of his more fundamental theoretical insights. Again, let's recall that for Jacobi, the answer to nihilism wasn't irrationalism, but realism. So I just want to discuss briefly two sort of contemporary accounts of the salto that I think are really helpful for understanding, again, the sort of contemporary relevance of what Jacobi has going on. So one is from Prolix and the other one is from Kieran Nissenbaum. So Prolix and Nissenbaum both take up the theme of the salto in order to provide a thicker understanding of this central yet underdeveloped concept. Both resist the temptation to equate the salto with irrationalism. Both view the salto as a cornerstone for a form of rationality distinct from the kind that Jacobi ultimately condemns. So Prolix explains, quote, this salto is an active leap of ascent to what is immediately felt but cannot be explained. It is a choice of a certain kind of system, the system of freedom, and in this, it is a conceptual assent to the undeniable feeling that freedom makes sense as an explanation of human experience. So the salto contains both epistemic and non-epistemic elements. It is a conceptual assent, but it is based upon or grounded in non-conceptual given, namely a feeling held by way of a firm conviction. So Prolix continues, quote, but it is also an active assent, an activity that itself grounds the feeling of freedom. It is, after all, the active embrace of human freedom that one is finally able to make the salto mortale. And it is really only in acting freely that one can feel one's freedom. So, and that's the end of the quote. So this is perhaps not too novel an idea, right? That the act of freedom precedes any knowledge of freedom is a thought to which Descartes and Fichte, for example, would likewise assent. So to exist, is the consequence of a positing that occurs through an act of judgment. However, for Fichte, this free act is grounded by the I's capacity for rational self-determination. Alternatively, for Jacobi, a feeling through faith must precede the act of the salto. We see that though the salto is based on a feeling, it is not itself passive. It is the free act of the salto, in the free act, freedom is both felt and grounded. Thus, instead of representing a complete rejection of reason, on this reading, the salto is a plea for the primacy of a certain type of practical reasoning. Right. So again, what we can continuously see when we really dig into Jacobi is that he's not really all of that far from a lot of his sort of German idealist contemporaries. So this is always just very fascinating to me. So Nissenbaum comes to a similar conclusion in her discussion of the salto. First, she situates the salto as inheriting an insight from Spinoza, namely that, quote, Jacobi's objection to Spinoza's monistic ontology is also tempered by his appreciation for Spinoza's key insight that the absolute cannot be apprehended reflectively through any process of ratiocination, but that such apprehension must be achieved through intuition or insight, end quote. Spinoza, on this account, also rejects the capacity of inferential reasoning alone to know God. However, Jacobi inverts Spinoza by attributing intuitive and immediate knowing to the senses and not to the intellect. Nissenbaum continues, quote, assenting to a belief that is based upon a need of reason is different from assenting to a belief that is based upon inclination, since the latter only provides us with a subjective ground for assent, end quote. So we again see that the Salto is a kind of self-grounding. In the leap, the thinker finds reasons for belief that are not true or false in relation to other beliefs. Thus, quote, we can conclude that Jacobi's aim is not to overthrow reason, but to restore reason by establishing the primacy of reason in its practical use, end quote. Again, the Salto is not a leap out of reason, but is instead a leap back into the immediate world of familiar everydayness. It is not a leap into the unknown, but a daring retreat into a world left behind. So I guess I didn't read this part, but recall Jacobi's discussion cited above of, quote, ancient people for whom the entire world was alive. It is this living world of action into which the Salto daringly tumbles. It is this living world that grounds the possibility of inferential and conceptual reasoning, and not the other way around. What we must keep in mind is that it is faith that makes the Salto into the lost world of immediacy possible. To feel the living real upon which the rational knowledge of cause and effect is based, one must first have faith. In other words, faith is a mode of access that access to the ground that renders inferential knowledge referential. So both Prolix and Nissenbaum come to similar conclusions regarding the primacy of the practical as a consequence of Jacobi's Salto. However, neither explicitly reaches the point of connecting it with Jacobi's explicitly stated silver bullet against nihilism, the nihilism of transcendental idealism, namely realism. So commenters such as Frank, Beiser, and Snow all openly acknowledge the influence of Jacobi's realism on the subsequent idealists and romantics. But one last step is in order if we are to fully understand the complex nexus of concepts Jacobi deploys in order to reclaim realism through faith. And this is his renewed appeal to divine creation. So this is where we're going to sort of reintroduce that category of transcendence in order to understand what realism is for Jacobi. So Jacobi writes, it is the instrument of the almighty love or the secret laying of the hand of the creator. Only by this means can the blessing of life, the blessing of an existence that externalizes itself and thereby enjoys itself, be bestowed upon a multitude of beings and a world be called forth out of nothing, end quote. Through the faith that makes the Salto possible, one falls back into the world of immediacy that has been covered over and ultimately erased by theoretical reason. The next step is to acknowledge that this living world could only come from this transcendent divine creator. So only through the laying of the hand and the love of the divine can something come out of nothing. This allows one to break free from the consequences of the fundamental law of rationalism, the principle of sufficient reason. So, and then this is one of my favorite quotes from Jacobi. He says, a shiver goes down my spine whenever I think of this. Every time it is as if I received my soul directly from the hand of the creator in that instant, end quote. So though Jacobi does advocate for the necessity of a kind of self-grounding and self-justifying practical rationality, this practical rationality is not sufficient in and of itself. There must exist a living world with a mind-independent structure inscribed by the divine into which one falls, right? So that brings us back to the independence thesis from earlier. Good. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, there must exist a living world with a mind-independent structure inscribed by the divine into which one falls. We can see the difference between Jacobi's use of faith and the Salto Mortale on the one hand, and the notion of intellectual intuition Schelling develops on the other. So again, despite the really interesting overlaps between the two, I think there's an important difference there. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop reading there. So thank you all for listening. And sort of like I said, I'm very interested in answering any questions you have on that, but I'm also sort of interested in, because in this group we're trying to bring together folks that work on idealism from a bunch of different ways. I'm interested in hearing about maybe what Jacobi misses, or how sort of idealists outside of the German idealist tradition would respond to this set of problems that he looks at.
Okay, well, if people want to either raise their hand on the Zoom or put their question in the chat, I can voice it to Ben. If not, I have an initial question we can get to get the ball rolling with. Okay, I'll start, then we'll see who else comes in. So Ben, could you I think explicate a bit more about why Jacobi takes the saltum mortale to be a choice, particularly this sort of agential language he builds into it. Why you might think the commitment to realism is not a choice. It's just a absolute presupposition of thought in general, of being a rational being at all. That there's some kind of irrational grounding to rationality. So yeah, I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to start. So I think that the way that I would try to explain it is that Jacobi is beginning from the perspective that philosophy has lost something, right? He doesn't initially sort of start out this way, but by the time of his letter to Fichte, he's very explicit that he's not interested in doing philosophy anymore. He calls himself a non-philosopher who's interested in what he calls non-knowledge and this kind of stuff, right? So one of the ways that I think about it is it's a choice because philosophy is an error, right? We can choose to sort of follow this train, philosophical train, right? Which for Jacobi, essentially all philosophy is Spinozism that kind of culminates in this sort of idealism, right? That is only concerned with the relationship between things, discounts the idea that our sensations must somehow be produced in reality in a relationship to an independently existing thing. And so what he wants to do is say, right, you don't have to fix philosophy to get out of this trap, right? That's why it's a choice. So the choice there is to, again, reacquaint oneself, as he sees it, with the world that we knew before these kind of philosophical projects emerged. You know, again, and I think maybe Chris, you can agree or disagree with me on this, but it's not unlike the division that Schelling later draws between negative and positive philosophy, right? The turn to positive philosophy is a choice by the philosopher, right? One has to recognize the limits and shortcomings of a certain philosophical approach and then choose, right, to fall back into the world. So I guess in more direct response to the way you framed it, Paulo, it would be a choice to reclaim the idea that realism is sort of simply a presupposition of rationality, right? That's something that somehow we have forgotten. Does that kind of respond to what you were getting at?
Okay. I don't think it's the end of the conversation, but I think we'll let Rolf go at this point.
Yeah, well, thanks for this excellent talk. I mean, you have really outlined all these aporias really nicely. My question sort of goes into the direction of Paulo's question about the saltum mortale. So my question, I wonder, what is the mediator, the medium between idealism and realism, between transcendence and immanence, between, you know, the world of ideas and ideals and the factual reality? There seems to be something missing, and I think what's missing is the body. And admittedly, I'm coming from both phenomenology, you know, Mello and Hermann Schmitz and so on, and from poetic discourse. And at least in poetic discourse, there is always, around 1800, where we are right now, there's always the sense that my sort of bodily existence in the world mediates between my mind and the general ideas and the factual world. And I wonder if Jacobi sort of reflects about this, or whether he wants to leave that gap, that aporia between transcendence and immanence, as I think you mentioned at one point, deliberately open and unmediated. But if that's the case with Jacobi, not in your presentation, which I really like, but in Jacobi, then I think there is something dramatically missing, and maybe deliberately on Jacobi's part, or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So that kind of allows me to dig just a little bit into the section I skipped over. But first, the transcendence of realism for Jacobi, I kind of draw that from this quote about that I start with, right? This idea of nonsense or being out of one's mind is when you collapse any distance between things and sensations, or thoughts and things, right? So Jacobi is really clear that there has to be a sort of infinite distance between that sort of reality and this kind of ideality, right? But then to get to really the core of your question, like, and this is why, one of the reasons why I find focusing on Jacobi to be so interesting, because he does have this kind of phenomenological, especially in the tradition of Merleau-Ponty, understanding of how those things would be bridged, right? So this is from the section that I skipped over, but it has to do with this notion of life, right? So I'm just going to give you a quote here from Jacobi. He says, "Certainly, we have the most intimate consciousness of what we call our life, but who can grasp it as a representation? And our soul is nothing else but a certain determinate form of life. I know nothing more perverse than to make life into a property of things, when things are, on the contrary, only properties of life, only different expressions of it. For the parts in a manifold can penetrate one another and become one only in a living being," right? So it's exactly this kind of notion of life that does string together these different concepts, right? So he's going to say that we have unmediated certain knowledge in the existence of the external world, but then because we are living beings, that's how our rationality is able to develop, right? These notions, he specifically talks about unity and multiplicity, cause and effect, right? That's as we are living beings. And then the final step for this, for him, is the idea that that life that we experience, that we are properties of, right, is from divine creation. So that's then how we get to that final step of sort of bridging the gap. And that's how he wants to do it, right? And like I said, I think that there are some through lines there that would apply to, right, this understanding of life as, again, this sort of omnipresent property, right? And it's not necessarily this kind of pan-vitalist way of thinking about things, because there would have to be a distinction between the way that we understand the life that we are properties of and divine life, right? Because Jacobi was also very interested and very much needed for there to be this personal God, right? And he shares that with Schelling as well. So there would have to be some kind of distinction there, but it also is life that kind of builds that connection. So I hope that kind of begins to tie some of that together.
Yeah, and we could have another discussion, and that would be for another time, whether life is identical with bodily presence. I'm not quite sure if that's the case. It will later on be for Lebensphilosophie and vitalism, but maybe not for the idealists. But I would have to think about that a little further. I just want to leave that as an open question for, at least for me, to think about it.
Absolutely, right. So I think that definitely the post-Kantians would share with Jacobi the idea that life isn't a representation, right? We don't really have representational knowledge of life or something like that, right? So for Schelling, and this is sort of a major theme in the book, life has to do with conflict, right? And then the properties that we are, properties of life, are emergent properties of that conflict, right? So there is a shared sort of, it's definitely a shared lineage going on there. But yeah, it would be really interesting to kind of consider through how this kind of connects on to that Lebensphilosophy. Yeah, and then the 20th century embodied phenomenology and stuff like that. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure.
Chris, take it away.
Well, thanks for that wonderful talk. And this has been a great discussion. I'm having a little trouble following the irrationalism. So I know from the debate between Reinhold and Schulze and Maimon that the premises are missing from Kant's original argument in regards to transcendental philosophy. And so Reinhold presents a ground of this, looking for the apodictic certainty of metaphysics in terms of, the fact of consciousness. And then we get into this debate about skepticism from Schulze and Maimon, etc. My question is transcendental philosophy irrational because of how the world conforms to the kind of the conditions of all possible experience, that the faculties of our understanding for Jacobi? Or is this more to do with appearances? Because you laid out, you brought up the idea that realism starts off with facts and entities and deals with the objective and it's mind independent. But for Kant, it's not that Kant is skeptical of the world. You could oddly call him an empirical realist, but for him, we can never really get at the things in themselves. And so we're always left with this kind of this barrier around us. And so I'm just trying to wonder where the irrationalism comes from. I'm sorry if this brings us back to the beginning of your talk or not.
No, that's perfect. So yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking of a number of different things. I think that first, what I would note is that, Jacobi's criticism, particularly in this David Hume piece, is not that philosophy, transcendental philosophy, idealist philosophy is irrational, right? Like, in a certain sense, what he's saying is it's too rational. And in being too rational, it slips into this state where, right, again, it's considered with, right, it's the immanent or internal critique of reason performed by reason upon itself, right? And in that sense, you can think about it like kind of like spinning off like a balloon or something like that, right? It leaves that kind of living ground that Jacobi believes is necessary in order to, right, say something about actual things. So philosophy is not necessarily irrational, but it's mad, right? He also, another thing that he refers to, and this is, calling back to Descartes, obviously, is he says that you can't tell a difference between a philosopher and a sleepwalker, right? So in a certain sense, philosophy has no answer to that kind of the skeptical challenge, right, according to Jacobi. And this is why he's advocating, to sort of come back to some of what Paulo was bringing up earlier, for a leaving behind of a certain form of philosophy as such, right, to get back to this kind of living every day, the world of sensations, where we no longer doubt our sensations, right? He says that's not a necessary step, right? And I guess just really quickly in terms of, so Kant talks about empirical realism, right? It's important for him. And Jacobi is a little bit dismissive on this account, right? Like, how can you hold that to be true while also holding the sort of things in themselves doctrine, right? And so, yeah, again, the point about irrationalism that I was trying to make is just that there's a kind of body of literature that tries to reduce what Jacobi's up to as this sort of irrationalism, right? And there's this idea that because he's a critic of philosophy, that therefore he must be a critic of all forms of rationality, or a critic of reason as a whole, or something like that. But he's really not, right? And it's what's important to point out in that context is that Jacobi does have a pretty restrictive perception on what philosophy is, right? He says that, Spinozism is the most consistent form of philosophy, which is a claim that's actually shared by a whole bunch of people of this time. And then when he extends that criticism to Fichte in the open letter, he says, my entry point into the science of knowledge was Spinoza. I was unable to understand this text without Spinoza. And then he basically refers to it as an inverted Spinozism, right? So and that's the kind of height of philosophy, which is nihilism. So he then has this sort of restricted understanding of philosophy, and is basically going to respond to some of the critics that you brought up earlier, and say, like, yes, there is no philosophical solution for the skeptical challenge, right? And I think that is in large part what some of these folks that kind of came up, right, during the Spinoza controversy and during the pantheism controversy, that was what they were trying to work past, right? There's a lot of force in Jacobi's criticism, and there's a lot going on there. But I think that, people rightfully wanted to, right, maintain some kind of ability of philosophy to respond to those problems. So that's why I think he's such a helpful counterpoint in understanding how particularly Hegel and Schelling begin to move forward. Does that get at some of the concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. That cleared up a lot, actually.
All right, I'll step in with another one. Rolf kind of drew the parallels to Merleau-Ponty, the concept of life as well. On the other side of the channel, obviously, there's someone who sounds also very similar to what you've described as Jacobi's view, and that's later Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Who also takes a view of, well, philosophy is sort of a mistaken project. Correct, kind of, we have to make the choice to turn away from that project because it's sort of a misunderstanding of the power of language. I guess I was wondering if you had any insights into that parallel, the way which maybe Jacobi shares the similarity to the phenomenological tradition that came up in the 20th century. He might also share with you mentioned the ordinary language tradition earlier in the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Wittgenstein is by no means someone with whom I am extensively familiar, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of the grounding of the positive side of the project here, right? Is to say that, like, Wittgenstein thinks that, a lot of philosophical problems cannot be solved because they're not real problems, right? And so once we go back into that ordinary language, right, once we return to that everyday world of lived experience, that's where we can begin to kind of, dissolve some of these worries, right? You don't have to live in this kind of paralyzing Cartesian, skeptical, anxious, mode of being or something like that for Jacobi. And, I think that I think that one of the reasons why looking at this as an influence to, again, the German idealists is something that they were pushing back against, but also is something that really continues on, right, through the 20th century and even into these 21st century realisms, is this idea that all of this kind of grows out of, right, Jacobi's just general worries about what philosophy does and can do. So unfortunately, like, I can't really speak too much into detail about that in relationship to Wittgenstein, but I think it's there. I think that this is, kind of, not directly, but in part growing out of worries that both of them continue to share, right? And this is something that I find really fascinating about this, is that despite the kind of philosophical developments that have occurred since, right, Jacobi wrote these, very controversial works, this worry still hasn't been surmounted, right? And we keep trying these different things. Another way to look at, another person I think picks up on this, right, is Heidegger and Heidegger's usage of language, right? He's trying to use a type of language in his philosophical writings that he thinks is going to return us once again to this thing that has been forgotten. So yeah, that's kind of what I have on that. I'm sorry there's no more details, but
I suppose the kind of my last lingering thought is both Jacobi, Wittgenstein, these people, they have a sort of view that there was a moment of innocence a moment in which we weren't making the mistake.
Mhm.
And there's a question about whether or not that's actually true. And then there's a further question about whether the return to innocence is possible.
Mhm.
That somehow you can just turn the philosophy off
Mhm.
and do it in good faith or something like that. I mean, those kind of worries are the ones that kind of always leave me unconvinced by people like Wittgenstein, and I think also Jacobi so far.
Mhm.
That there's either there never was innocence or there is no return to it. Does Jacobi kind of address those kind of thoughts?
I mean, that's a great question, right? I do think that for Jacobi, part of it is going to be from a honestly, like a religious presupposition, right? So even though he tries to push back against this at certain points, he's like, oh, people tell me like I'm just a Christian. I'm not just a Christian. I have philosophical reasons for all of these concerns and stuff like that. There is this sense in which, there would have been this, the time of, is it Benjamin that talks about Adamic naming, right? The kind of naming that happened in the Garden of Eden in this sort of perfect language, and then the fall from that, and then the hypothetical return to it. Yeah, I don't really know. I haven't dug into anywhere where he kind of explains that presupposition. So, but it worries me too, right? I think that this idea that theoretical and practical rationality are not strictly divided, right? This just sort of ground level idea shared by Hegel and Schelling, right? I think that is also in Jacobi. And I think that there's something fundamentally correct about that, right? That when we describe the world, when we use reason, that there's something creative about it. Right? Schelling uses this phrase of creative reasoning. When we think about things, we make things, right? And I think that that's the sort of, a general kernel of the idealists or the idealism that they're going to embrace against the kind of idealism that Jacobi is criticizing. But yeah, I think that, Jacobi is that point where he sets up this problem, but doesn't think through it any further. So yeah, I'm not really sure what the promise of redemption is there. Interestingly, in these books, he talks a lot about God the creator, but doesn't often sort of bring up Christ and salvation and resurrection, right? Which one would think would be the point of that narrative where, we have all fallen back into that ordinary world, and, our thoughts are, not things, and we're not crazy anymore, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, again, it's a really rich question about, to what extent is this criticism of philosophy still philosophical at its core? And to what extent does it have that kind of metaphysical presupposition of this Christian narrative of fall and redemption? So yeah, it's a great question. It's really helpful.
Okay, Ben, do you want to call it there?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm sorry I didn't really talk about idealism all that much, but
yeah, Chris, do you want to send us off?
Oh, we're gonna end a little earlier today.
Yeah, I think that's
do you have a question otherwise?
No, I don't. Not at all. No. This was a really I really enjoyed the conversation, actually, because I'm working through these thinkers right now, actually. Not Jacobi. I haven't reached Jacobi yet. This is why. But I've read pieces of what you've written about him in your text. But thank you so much, Ben, for presenting pieces of your text and what you had today. This is fascinating. It was a really good discussion, from thinking about concepts from the past, and also bringing in more modern thinkers, contemporary philosophers as well, Maya Sue and Liz you brought up. Yeah, so thank you all for attending, from all over the world, and thank you all for your questions and your participation. We do have a website now. If you go on to Google and you type in Idealist Society of North America.com, you can find our website. You can actually join our mailing list from there as well too, to keep up on all of our events. So we'll send you emails about these other events. And yes, thank you so much. And that's really much all I have to say, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for listening. All right.